be just talking to each other, and of course talking to you. And it's just an incredible delight to be with one of my old friends, Nirupama Rao. And I never really thought that after so many years, I'll be with her on a public stage at a poetry festival discussing the Beatles. Because she's a diplomat, of course, world-famous diplomat. And I'm, a political commentator for many years, quite far removed from poetry, both of us, in many ways. And yet we are here in this occasion, and and that is the most amazing thing about life and poetry and music, that it brings us all together. And Nirupama, it's quite amazing that we've been brought together after so many years by this surprise offer from my publishers some years ago to write a book on the Beatles, to create this very fascinating of the Beatles to India after 50 years, that they did so. Because exactly 50 years ago, they were at Rishikesh. And I, of course, grabbed it with both hands because I've sort of covered various politicians, prime ministers, and leaders. My last book was on Mayawati, the Dalit leader. But the Beatles, of course, is something I've always been very close to. We are of the Beatles generation, of course. And I fell in love with the Beatles, as a teenage rebel in Calcutta. And I remember that when I was 15, my biggest fights with my father was on the length of my hair, which, of course, I wanted to copy, as the Beatles had at that time. And I think the Beatles and their music and their lyrics, as they changed over the years, also reflected what we were going through as young adults. And I think that their simple love songs, which we loved so much to dance, then later changed into far more complex, radical, and often they were social commentaries. And I remember that how the Beatles influenced us in our ideas. So I was just wondering that what were your experiences, when you were growing up, at roughly, in a totally probably different city, but probably with similar experiences.
Absolutely. First of all, let me tell you that this is a fascinating read. And I spent a sleepless night last night reading the book. And I actually couldn't put it down. It was so fascinating. I think one reason why I particularly related to the book, Ajoy, is because, as you said, we are from the Beatles generation. And it brought back such beautiful memories of that time when it was bliss in that dawn to be alive, literally, the world was at our feet, and through the music of the Beatles and the words and the sentiments that were expressed through that music, it seemed that we were one with that world around us. We were not confined, you to Kolkata or me to Kunur in the Nilgiris, where I was going to school and where I first heard about the Beatles. We were not confined by that sense of being limited to the space we were in. We could connect with what they were saying. Because I think what particularly appealed to me as a young girl growing up in South India at that time was not just the music or the rhythm or the beats of that music, but just the beautiful poetry, the lyrics that were you could, see standing out with each song. And as you rightly point out in the book, they began as this little group, mop-head, young Liverpool boys, singing love songs, and then they evolve into, they become kind of pulse takers of the world around them. They speak of war and love and loss and longing and psychedelic images, of course, some of which have brought on by the use of hallucinatory drugs, but it certainly left very beautiful poetry for us. And I find that it's not just our generation, my son's generation. My son, who's 30 now, just loves the Beatles, and he can sing almost every Beatles song. And one of his prized possessions is a book I bought for him from one of my travels, which is a whole compendium of all the Beatles songs written. And I have here with me, in fact, I brought to the festival a book I bought from the Soviet Union. I bought it in Russia after the Soviet Union had collapsed, but it was published in Moscow just before the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and it's a Beatles songbook. So when they wrote back in the USSR, and they spoke about the girls in Georgia and Ukraine, obviously it did have an effect. It did have an effect. It just crossed barriers, it transcended boundaries, it went beyond the politics of the Cold War, and in many ways, I think it showed you that the world is really one.
You know, it's quite amazing, really to think back and look at what we thought of the Beatles and what the Beatles thought of India. Because I think for us, the Beatles meant, to some extent, my father hated the Beatles so much because he was into classical, Hindustani classical music, he was into Western classical music, and he found this pop music, this sort of screaming fans, and particularly the early Beatles, there was so much noise around them. And he said, this is not music, it's noise. And what kind of lyrics were these? I mean, they were just sort of simple little ditties. But yet, to us, those simple early songs of the Beatles were so beautiful. And I was just wondering, since you sing so well, would you sort of try, say, And I Love Her? That's such a lovely, lovely song, which is so simple. The ballad is really a simple love song, and the words could not get simpler, and yet it is so, it touches your heart, right?
Yeah, it's true. And from which period of the Beatles is this?
This is early Beatles.
Yeah, before
absolutely.
India.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I'll try to sing it. I haven't sung it in a long time. I give her all my love, that's all I do. And if you saw my love, you'd love her too. And I love her. She gives me everything, and tenderly the kiss my lover brings, she brings to me, and I love her.
Amazing, 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 Nirupama. Without accompaniment, without anything, you bring, our youths alive again. Huh?
That's
when
true.
we were young and we were, at that age, falling in love perhaps. And, the Beatles meant a lot to us.
I used to play guitar, I remember. And I went to Missouri to the training at the IFS Academy with a guitar slung over my shoulders. That was our generation, I think.
Gosh,
yeah.
What did the other IS guys think about that?
They were a little bit taken aback, I think. I was really the nowhere girl. I had come from nowhere with this guitar because I didn't know soul. I wasn't from Delhi or Mumbai, Bombay as it was called, or Madras or Calcutta. I was from a small town, but I came with this guitar and I occasionally sang a Beatles song too.
And then, the Beatles, and one of the things about the book is that I rediscovered the Beatles because, as just a fan, you listen to their music and you start with their early numbers, and then you grow up and then you move on to their later, as sort of every time their albums came out, you bought them, and it's what a pleasure it was to buy those albums, those old LP records. Of course, I mean, you went on to, of course, other sort of, if you were into rock music those days, you know, and then the Rolling Stones, the Doors, the Pink Floyd, the Who, and a whole range of rock musicians produced music. But it's only when I started researching the book that I rediscovered, you know, the Beatles and how great musical artists they were. You know, it's quite amazing, Nirupama. I was speaking to Philip Norman, the big biographer of the Beatles. And Philip Norman was saying that the Beatles, and he knew them on first name terms, and he said the Beatles themselves never ever thought they would last more than 10 years after they broke up. And here it is that after 50 years, they came to India, and about 46 years after they broke up, or 47 years, because they broke up shortly after they went back from India. We are discussing the Beatles. I'm writing a book, at a poetry festival, and this thing, it's just incredible, their durability. And I think one of the reasons why I feel that the Beatles have lasted, and their lyrics have lasted, and they've crossed generations, is not just us, the Beatles generation, who like the Beatles, but as you say, our children, and probably their children, because, it's quite amazing that I was in Bangalore a few months ago launching my book. And so I must say Bangalore is such an amazing city because we had, of course, this group of musicians who were singing. But there were so many amateur singers who just came on the floor and started singing. And one of the singers was a 5-year-old who sang Hey Jude with so much passion. So it just carries on. I mean, the Beatles' magic carries on. And I think one of the reasons why that they've carried on so long was that the Beatles managed to reinvent themselves, as they went along into completely different singers than what they were. And I think that's, what amazes me is that when you're so successful with the first model you got as pop stars, because mind you, they had just such an incredible fan base at that time. But yet they were very dissatisfied, and they were disparaging about songs like what you just now sang. But they started getting now, more and more inventive as they went along. And they started singing songs like The Fool on the Hill. And The Fool on the Hill is a very interesting song because Paul McCartney, who wrote the song before he actually met the Maharishi. But after he met the Maharishi, he said, I think I had a premonition of meeting the Maharishi because The Fool on the Hill sounded quite a bit like the Maharishi. And I was just wondering, Nirupama, can I just sort of trouble you again because you sing so well? Can we try Fool on the Hill?
Yeah, before I try and do that, reading through your book, one of the great characters in the book, besides the Beatles, and especially I think the character of George Harrison, which you delineate so beautifully, is the Maharishi himself. And it was just fascinating to read about his history, starting out as this young, kayast boy who attaches himself to Swami Brahmananda Saraswati and acquires some spiritual stature. And then
he was the wrong caste to be his
wrong
successor.
caste, yes. I mean, one of those things that, strike you about how, the surprises that spring at you when you read about such personalities. And then he goes on, travels the length and breadth of India, and he's so publicity conscious, and he's looking for that famous following, and he gets it with the Beatles and Mia Farrow and the others who come to Rishikesh. And I was just thinking of that ashram in Rishikesh today. You said the Beatles' memory, of course, is evergreen, and it's still as fresh as it was 50 years ago. But that ashram has just decayed and fallen into ruin. I would have thought, with our focus on tourism and Incredible India, we would have had the imagination to keep that, going as a tourist spot. It's of, global significance because of the fact that the Beatles are a global phenomenon. And I think we should really think on those lines.
Well, the good thing is that I think because of this whole celebration of the 50th anniversary a bit, maybe because this book has got its own publicity, which it generated. I think something is being done on that.
That's good.
I think that they are seriously thinking of doing a museum. I think there will be some big music festivals held there. And hopefully, and it's very sad when you go there, because I went there, and there are people coming from all over the world still, and all over India. And later, I'm sure you'll read that passage which I wrote,
yes.
how I end the book, about who I met there. But it's quite amazing that that place has really got no facilities at all, and it's part of the forest, really. And nobody's really looked after something which anywhere else in the world would have become a huge, huge heritage spot. And it would be such a tremendous money spinner for the government. I don't know what we're really thinking. We have such treasures here, and we don't do it. Absolutely. But I still want to hear Fool on the Hill.
I'll try. It has many sharps and flats. Let's see. Day after day, alone on the hill, the man with the foolish grin is keeping perfectly still. But nobody wants to know him. They can see that he's just a fool, and he never gives an answer. But the fool on the hill sees the sun going down, and the eyes in his head see the world springing round.
Lovely. And, you can quite understand why Paul felt that it could be the Maharishi, because Maharishi had that. He was the giggling guru, and everybody felt that nobody could understand him, and he was quite a fool to giggle like that and talk about a mantra which would solve everything. But, Nirupama, I mean, look at the kind of paradox, really, of, this whole cultural, exchange between the East and the West, in many ways. The Beatles are these amazing stars in the West. And yet, something, obviously, they're not satisfied with, and they're looking for something more. John Lennon, for instance, is tormented by his inner demons. Very troubled man, a tremendous creative genius, but very troubled. And he turns to hard drugs, but even hard drugs is not really giving him the kind of sort of transcendental, dreams which satisfy him. And then they really turn to India, which has been introduced, of course, quite accidentally to George Harrison, exactly, because he picks up a sitar at this film set, of Help. And so they turn to India. They turn to India, and it changes in many ways, and is so much an integral part of reinventing themselves. Absolutely. Their early years were basically stage performances. And suddenly they're sick of those stage performances, although they bring them amazing fame, huge amounts of money, and yet they are dissatisfied themselves. So they reinvent themselves, and India becomes, and Indian music becomes, and Indian instruments becomes a huge, huge trigger for the new Beatles. And I think that it is a part of their musical regeneration. It's also a part of they're seeking ancient wisdom. And I think the 60s saw that, and that was, in fact, the beginning of the hippie sort of trail, because the Beatles really triggered this huge hippie movement, which came to India, this hippie trail, as it is called. And now, in fact, there are many books about them. And yet, here, we were looking at the Beatles quite differently, weren't we?
I guess so. I think, this was an era when India, in many ways, we talk of the opening of the Indian economy from 1991, but the opening of India to the world was really happening much before that. If you remember, when we were children, there was no dearth of information available to us. Books and comics and music, everything was freely imported into the country. There was absolutely no control, no strictures on accessing all that beautiful world out there. I think that made a difference. That made us who we are today. We are open to the world. We don't have closed minds. We are very comfortable in our shoes as Indians, but we're very comfortable dealing with the world also. And I think the Beatles was very much a part of that experience and that process and that whole coming into India. We came together, literally, the world and India. And I always identify my experience of the Beatles with that period of my growing up, when the world was at our feet, literally. We didn't have very much in terms of material comforts or possessions, but we had access to the world outside.
Oh, absolutely, because, me, say, growing up in a Bengali family, Calcutta in the 60s, I grew up in a North Calcutta locality where, every evening there was Rabindra Sangeet playing all the time. You were very much, in the 60s, there was a huge literary movement. There was a great poetry movement in Calcutta. So we were very much a part of that generation which imbibed local culture. And yet, almost seamlessly, we were multiculturalists as well. And we engaged with, say, something like the Beatles.
Absolutely.
And it came like a breath of fresh air. And what my father feared, that it would, spoil corrupt us of our aesthetic sensibilities. Because for the Bengali Bhadralok, that was the fear, that you'd let this new Western crass commercial culture destroy. And it didn't. Actually, it enhanced, us. And the Beatles themselves, because they had a completely open mind to India, also helped us to open our minds to them.
Absolutely.
So this cultural osmosis is fascinating, isn't it?
And talking about parents, I must say my parents really encouraged us into this kind of music. They didn't sing, they didn't have any musical education, but I remember my father buying me my first guitar and buying me the long-playing record of Sgt. Pepper's. It wasn't available in India, but a friend of his was going to Singapore, and we got it from there. And it's a prized possession. And I remember walking into Brigade Road, and at the head of Brigade Road, where it meets Mahatma Gandhi Road. We called it Mahatma Gandhi Road those days, and today it's MG Road. On the right, there was this lovely HMV record store where I bought most of my Beatles records. And it was a world apart, I feel. Very, very different.
And I was just thinking that, in a larger sense, the role of music and the role of lyrics, in expressing ourselves, in listening to a variety of music, including the Beatles, that really kind of, enhances oneself. One amplifies, one's personality.
Absolutely.
Because over the years, when you go back to these songs and you hear them, you may have completely different feelings today than when you first heard them, but they've stayed with you. And I think that is this sort of incredible quality, whether it's poetry, whether it's music, that really, that sort of cultural, the sense of cultural bonding with your own local culture, with the culture of a faraway land, and a kind of larger global culture we are looking at.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's quite incredible because, I mean, I know that you are now involved with this very interesting project, your South Asian Symphony Foundation. And, you know, to some extent, it's sort of kind of bringing
Absolutely.
everybody together. And to some extent, there is a resonance, you know, to what the Beatles were doing. You know, this bridge between different countries, between different cultures through music.
I think it comes from our growing up years and what influence, you know, groups like the Beatles had on us. And there's a passage, beautiful passage in your book towards the end, which I think deserves to be read out. Since we're coming to the end, I think we're being warned about the time running out. But, you know, you say here, and at the penultimate stage of your book, half a century after the Beatles came to India, both their memory and legacy remain strong, much as it is elsewhere, in a country where popular music is dominated by Bollywood, along with mushrooming regional variations. It is surprising how much the Beatles have continued to be culturally relevant. And then you say at the end, this is the last bit of your book, it says, interestingly, there appears to be a fresh outburst of adulation for the Beatles among the present teenage generation in India. At the ashram ruins in Rishikesh, now being resurrected as a Beatles memorial, a 45-year-old mother complained that she had been dragged there by her 17-year-old daughter from a tour by the family of Hindu temples in the Valley of Saints. And when asked what she found so special about a group that belonged to the last century, we're all from the last century, the teenager thought for a while and then said, "Their songs appeal to my heart." And that's really, you know, the meaning of the Beatles.
Yes, and you know, this whole business of heart and beyond the intellect, you know, in many ways, you and me, we lived by our intellect a lot. And, you know, you as a diplomat and me as an analyst, we sort of use our intellects most of the time, and we sort of are hard-headed, you know, people who look at, you know, facts and figures and trends and try to analyze them. But also, to some extent, and I think that's the great bond between us and between, you know, this whole larger audience, is that music and poetry, you know, brings us, you know, and gives us that added dimension where, you know, the heart comes in. And I think that this very young girl, talking about a group which belongs to the last century, I mean, how amazing is it that she is dragging her parents and saying, let's go and see where the Beatles came to India. And that the Beatles sort of remains in the memory. But, you know, I was just wondering that, you know, the title of my book, and, you know, it's quite an amazing story about the song, you know, that because the song is written by John Lennon just before he comes to India. And it has a very interesting background. You know, you know, it's in the book, and, you know, it's about John Lennon and his wife, Cynthia Lennon. And Cynthia Lennon, in their bedroom, is nagging him. And is nagging him because, possibly, that at that point, John had got interested in this Japanese, you know, avant-garde artist, Yoko Ono. And their marriage was breaking up. And it's a very sort of mundane husband and wife kind of fight, and she's nagging him. And John escapes from the bedroom. They have a very large house, of course, so they escapes from the bedroom, and these words of Cynthia Lennon are rolling around his head. And only John Lennon could do this. He turns this mundane fight with his wife into poetry, because that triggers of thoughts and images, which he then makes it sort of, you know, take him towards a spiritual sort of experience. and he talks and he ends with Jai Gurudev Om. So I was just wondering that, would you like to attempt, that song,
Attempt, certainly, but I don't know how it'll come out. Let's see. Across the universe. Words are flowing out like endless rain into a paper cup. They slither while they pass, they slip away across the universe. Pools of sorrow, waves of joy are drifting through my opened mind, possessing and caressing me. Jai Guru Deva, nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Words are flowing out like endless rain into a paper cup. They slither while they pass, they slip away across the universe. Pools of sorrow, waves of joy are drifting through my opened mind, possessing and caressing me. Jai Guru Deva.
Amazing. Really incredible. And John Lennon himself thought that was the best poetry he wrote. It had a very troubled history in recording, this song, which came out quite late, almost at the time they were breaking up. But, this song and the words and the lyrics are so haunting, are so beautiful. It's quite amazing, this sort of chorus of nothing's going to change the world. But, the Beatles did change the world in some ways. And I think that, that's a good note to sort of open the session for some questions. Possibly you may want to ask some questions. Anybody with questions?
How would you sing it?
No, I can't sing. I can't sing. So Nirupama's here to do all the singing.
Good evening. My name is Arvind Kumar Sinha. It's a privilege to seeing you people. I used to see Ajoy Bose during discussion with Arnav Goswami most of the time. And ma'am, I've seen you means most of the foreign tour and as you represented India in many way. So it's my privilege meeting you people live. So ma'am, my question is like, you're so beautiful singer. Why you not tried in the singing line?
I guess I wanted to be a diplomat from the age of 12, actually. That was my dream. So music, was the soundtrack to my life also, but certainly diplomacy was my vocation.
Thanks.
And we've got the best of both worlds, actually, because she now is devoting a lot of time to music and not just singing herself. Mind you, even when she was foreign secretary, she still did a performance, I remember, at the IIC, which was quite amazing. I think she's the only foreign secretary, in the history of India, who actually did a singing performance. But now, of course, it's very, very fascinating what she's doing. And so, of course, she's still involved in a lot of, diplomatic work, but she's also doing, a lot of singing.
When Lenin passed away, the Times of India caption was "Imagine there's no Lenin." But somehow it's not a world that we want to imagine without Lenin or the Beatles.
It's quite amazing. I'm glad you asked that question because I think John Lennon and the legend of John Lennon grew after he was shot in that very shocking manner. And it's quite amazing that although the Beatles broke up in '69, the legend of the Beatles actually grew after, the band broke up. And John Lennon's song of Imagine, which he sang individually and not as the Beatles, that somehow became an anthem song. That and Give Peace a Chance are these two songs which John did himself, without the Beatles. And I think after what many saw it as his martyrdom, John Lennon grew a larger-than-life personality. And it's quite amazing that of all the Beatles, in India certainly, and perhaps the rest of the world, John Lennon is probably the most popular. Although, and it's really funny that George Harrison in India should have been the most popular because he was probably the most famous Hindu in the world. You know, not many people know that, and in my book I go into George's fascination not just with Indian music, but with India's whole spiritual culture. And not many people know that when his mother was on her deathbed, and he was very fond of his mother, he was reciting the Bhagavad Gita. But, somehow George Harrison is not, all that sort of, known or not that sort of popular, in India, but it's John Lennon. And I think John Lennon's death, in many ways, and the way he died, that really sort of, I think, caught the public imagination. And as you know, that this song, Imagine, which still touches a lot of people, and particularly young people, because they want to imagine, a world which is far better. And it's still not there, obviously. But it still gives us that little hope, and you keep on imagining.
Nirupama, I just wanted to ask you, since this is a poetry festival, I don't think many people here know that you're also a published poet. And I want you to say something about what poetry has meant to you in your life. And if you can recollect offhand, maybe quote a few lines of your poetry to us.
I have the poetry in the custody of my husband at the moment, in that black bag he's carrying for me, like a good husband. Thank you, Lata, for asking that question. Well, poetry, I did do a session in the morning and I did read out some of my poems. Some of you who were there in the audience would have heard me recite my poetry. But I was attracted to poetry as a young girl at the same time that I got to know about the Beatles. I think, inspiration flows out of something inspiring that you hear, isn't it? That's how, you write and you express yourself because you're moved by something and you are inspired to do something yourself. So I guess I got into poetry. In a sense, music and poetry flowed together almost concurrently, as they say in good bureaucratic English, and simultaneously. So that's how I got into poetry. And in fact, I'll read a passage from the introduction to my poetry book as why I write poetry, I do not know. Somewhere along life's journey, poetry became my avenue of expression. And as I traveled along that journey, or my life's journey, my creative urge awoke. That's how it happened. I'll read a small poem. We talk of ourselves as India. I mean, we are India. We are a confluence of so many cultures and so many influences, and which have come to us from all over the world. And Central Asia is one of those founts. I mean, we have our own indigenous civilization and culture, but we've assimilated a lot of influences from elsewhere. So I'll read a poem called Samarkand. I was in, I'll do it. I was in Samarkand on an official mission, and you know how official missions are. You're running from meeting to meeting, and you hardly get to. But we did have time to visit Bukhara and Samarkand. I mean, we just had to do that, being in Uzbekistan. And that's where, from Baba came, the Emperor Baba came from the valley of Fargana, which is very close to these areas that I'm referring to. So it's called Samarkand Evening. And we were staying at a hotel called the Zarina. So we are in the Zarina, little house tucked away with the ersatz pool where a ghostly French mademoiselle first wets her feet and then glides in the water while we watch under velvet sky and the electricity gone. Someone lights a cigarette. It is only the only light that silhouettes Registan Square, where funny little children trill their tourist English, straddling Moscow and Samarkand, new century specimens. One of them, Aluk Beg, the astronomer's namesake, has his telescope trained on the Mercedes-Benz, which reminds him of spaces beyond this dusty, forgotten square, in a town where builders planted kisses on the cheeks of favorite queens, with death as a reward for level jumping. Nighttime has ghazals wafting in stillness. A train of couplets leaving Andalusia speeds like a rocket over North Africa. Berber sands weeping over Sir Darya into Samarkand, where we sit, our Urdu and English making sense of each other, even as realization glimmers that we are little more cells tossed by the history of these parts.
Yes? Of course. I mean, George Harrison and the Beatles came to India, and the India connection was definitely, Ravi Shankar had a major role to play. And not many people know that well before they came to Rishikesh, and I had a long interview with Patty Boyd, who was Patty Harrison, and Patty and George were taken around by Ravi Shankar on a cultural odyssey around India too. They lived on a houseboat in Srinagar and the Dal Lake. They went to Benares. They went to the Taj Mahal. They went to Ajanta Ellora caves and to Tirupati. And so a whole range of places, this young British couple were introduced to India's culture. And it just blew their minds. As Patty said, it blew my mind. Because it was a different world. And mind you, Ravi Shankar, you can imagine the impact of his personality. Because, you know, while I was writing this book, there is one entire chapter on Ravi Shankar. And I think that, I was just sort of captivated by the sheer range of this man's brilliance. So yes, Ravi Shankar played a very, very major role in bringing the Beatles to India, and the India connection is as much Ravi Shankar's doing as the Maharishis.